I am Francesco. I work at ADF as well. I'm a researcher, and I decided to talk about something which I think is quite kind of relevant to today, because I'm not exactly to this period, because as probably a lot of you know, in about a month the Danksharding hard fork is going to activate, and with that is going to come EIP 44.4, which is a pretty dramatic change in the data availability layer of Ethereum, and also sets the stage for future even maybe more substantial changes. So the idea of the talk is essentially to be a bit of a where we are coming from, where we are, and where we're going in terms of data availability layer. And yeah, so the starting point was actually one that had nothing to do with data availability in some sense. It's just this single blockchain, some might say monolithic blockchain, where essentially everyone downloads the whole data, and then blocks just contain transactions. Yeah. Blocks just contain transactions. Transactions have these little like blobs of data, which we call data, that essentially tell you all you need to know to execute them. You just execute everything, and that's the whole story. There's like, data really doesn't play kind of a special role here. But that has already changed quite a lot in the last few years. So we already entered this kind of new paradigm of the rollup-centered roadmap, where instead of just having this one Ethereum blockchain, we have a whole bunch of other blockchains that are essentially built on it, which we call rollups. For example, like Arbitrum Optimism and a bunch of others. At this point, it's like too long of a list to name. And the way they work essentially is that they utilize the Ethereum transactions, and especially the call data of Ethereum transactions. So there's again these little blobs inside the transactions to post their own transactions. And Ethereum basically doesn't execute those transactions, but just essentially checks their validity through some other means, like either optimistically or actually through verifying a proof. And this is kind of where the scalability comes from at this point. And yeah, so zooming in a bit more, you have these blobs of data that are contained in transactions on Ethereum. In this case, they're ones that have to do with Optimism. They themselves contain other transactions that are the ones that Optimism wants to use for its own chain, and essentially how you figure out what's going on with the Optimism chain is you read these transactions and execute them, and you get the chain. And yeah, basically the whole picture is kind of like this, like this roll-up chain essentially just reads from cold data on Ethereum, and this is the way that it figures out what its own state is. But in practice, things actually look a bit different than the picture before. Yes, we do have these Arbitrum Optimism, ZK whatever transactions with their call data on Ethereum, but actually most of Ethereum blocks are full of regular transactions, L1 transactions. And the reason for this is basically that call data is priced in the same way as all other resources that we have in Ethereum at the moment, which is gas. Like anything you want to do with a smart contract, basically anything you want to do on Ethereum, you're going to need to pay gas for. And basically, L2 transactions are competing with L1 transactions for gas, essentially. And it's hard for them to do so because L1 transactions are quite valuable. So essentially, the outcome that you get is that you would need a much bigger demand for rollups in order to actually fill up L1 blocks with rollup transactions because of this competitive effect. And the other thing is that we couldn't make call data cheaper so easily, because basically right now everyone keeps this call data forever essentially. Like you keep the whole history of the chain, and it's something that people have proposed to change, but it's not so. There's some pushback on that, and things would have to kind of be put in place in order to be sure that the history actually is retained in order to do that. And so essentially we had to take this into account that when cold data is put on chain, it's going to stick around forever, and so you don't want to make it too cheap essentially. And yeah, you can actually see that in practice this effect, because in theory Ethereum has about 1.8 megabytes per block of cold data maximum, but in practice what's used is like about 140, actually much less than that, kilobytes. So it's like about 1 gigabytes per day. You can see in this picture it's like a maximum it's actually never really reached. Usually it's more like 500 megabytes or something like that, and which corresponds to about, so 1 gigabyte would correspond to about 140 kilobytes, so still like more than an order of magnitude less than the theoretical maximum call data that Ethereum could potentially have in block. And yeah, basically this kind of sets the stage for this sets the stage for the next upgrade, EIP 4844. So the way EIP 4844 improves the situation is basically twofold. One is that it introduces this new data resource. So we kind of start doing away with cold data, at least as a resource for rollups. And basically this data resource, which we call blobs, has its own fee market, which is really an important thing. We kind of want to get rid of this competitive effect. And then we do history expiry just for blobs. So not trying to get this complete history expiry where nodes really just forget about the whole chain after some time, but just for blobs. So a bit more restricted and kind of easier, more palatable essentially. Yeah, so basically what blobs are is essentially just some bunch of arbitrary data, 128 kilobytes each. There's details to what they actually are, but it's not really super relevant here. And the kind of important thing for at least the purposes of this talk is that they have their own fee market, and it has this EIP 1559 style dynamic pricing that it really just works for blobs themselves. And this basically lets us set exactly a target of 3 blobs and a limit of 6 per slot, or whichever target and limit we would like. And this essentially makes it so that we can really regulate how much capacity we have. And because it doesn't have anything to do with the market for gas, it's really, we can really make sure that it's actually used. So if we set this capacity aside, this is the capacity that's going to be used essentially. Also we have history expiry, so now nodes essentially only have to keep this data around for about 18 days, which really limits the amount of storage space that they need for this. Per day, basically, with the EIP 4844, we'll have a target of about 2.7 gigabytes per day of blob data, which is, compared to what we saw before, so around like 500 megabytes, let's say, per day at the moment. It's like about a 5x increase in capacity, essentially. Which, obviously it's very good, and we'll see actually in a month how this actually looks in terms of fees and everything. But this kind of leaves a problem that EIP 4844 doesn't actually really do anything in terms of basically going beyond just depending on the bandwidth of individual full nodes. So we're still completely bottlenecked on how much can an individual full node handle in terms of bandwidth, because everyone is still downloading the whole data. So we've created this new data, these blobs, but everyone is downloading every blob. And we only get the scalability, the additional scalability from these fee market changes, essentially in the history expiry. And now we want to do more than that. We want to make sure that we are not actually bottlenecked anymore by the bandwidth in individual nodes, at least less than now. And you might have heard the term sharding. And if that tells you anything, you can see that there's nothing really sharded up to this point. Here comes essentially the next stage of what we essentially would like to do at some point after the next fork, which is data availability sampling, which has been the goal at this point for years. And at this point, the idea would be to do what, I'll explain what it means, but a one-dimensional version of data availability sampling. So the idea of data availability sampling is somewhat simple. It's that essentially we take a blob, which would be the blue part here, the left part, and then we essentially double its size in a special way, not just in any way, but we do it in a way where, and we call this an extension, where we basically introduce redundancy. This is also called erasure coding, so that as long as any 50% of it as long as you have any 50% of it, you can reconstruct the whole blob. This basically means that if you want to know that a blob exists, is available, you only need to make sure that 50% of it is available, which changes the problem quite a bit. And so the way this actually changes the problem is that now you can download only like a really small amount of the blob. You don't even need to download 50% of it. You only need to basically randomly pick a few points in the blob to ask. Like you ask someone, give me this point, and that point, randomly chosen. And if all of the points are actually available, with hyperability, the whole thing is available. And so the nice thing there is that you only need to download a constant amount of data, essentially, to make this check. Yeah, and basically, so that's for one blob, but we have potentially right now from 3 to 6, but it could be more. The way you would do it is that with more blobs is that essentially you do the same check, but for all blobs at once. So you essentially pick some indices and then just download like a column, like you stack blobs on top of each other, and then just a sample becomes, instead of a point on a blob, a whole column. This is essentially equivalent to just doing the check for each blob independently, but where you've fixed the randomness once, essentially. So this essentially, it's quite simple. It's still like a 1D, one-dimensional construction, but it allows you to check for all blobs at once. And yeah, the important question at this point is like, okay, sure, if like magically you can get these samples, you can make these checks, but how do you actually get the samples? And that's been, I guess, one of the main questions of research around this area for years at this point. So yeah, the idea at the moment is to do what we're calling peer DAS, and the peer part is essentially what tells you how it is that people actually get samples. So there's been like a variety of ideas around this area. So essentially, the idea of peer DAS is that you would just maintain all network infrastructure that we have today and just reuse it to do sampling. And this is kind of a simplification over a lot of other ideas that have been put forth. Like, for example, DHTs have been investigated for years, and they also have their own problem, but it's also a question of just complexity as opposed to just trying to reuse the networking component you already have. So the idea with peer DAS is literally just to do what you might think is the simplest thing possible, which is just ask your peers. You already have some set of networking peers that you keep for other things that you need to do in the consensus layer network. Just ask your peers for samples with some way of figuring out which peers are supposed to have which samples. So this essentially mostly simplification. But this doesn't kind of answer every question that we have, because still, how do these peers, all these nodes that you have around you that you're supposed to ask for samples, how do you actually get the samples is also a very important part of the question. And this we might call the distribution problem. So somehow the data has to be like disseminated in our network in the first place. And we want to avoid this being like another kind of bottleneck. And kind of at a high level, how you might think about distribution is we want to make sure that everyone only downloads a small part of the data as opposed to the whole data. Again, that's kind of the principle of the whole thing. In this case, it's not going to be a constant amount of data like with sampling, unfortunately. That's sort of unavoidable. But for example, right now, we're thinking that a good way to do this might be to have nodes download only 1/32 of the data. At a high level, it looks like you have some big piece of data. It's going to be just a bunch of blobs. Ultimately, you split it up in a certain way. You assign, basically, you partition the validator set in the same way. So let's say in 32 subsets, and you assign each subset to a piece of data. And just somehow people are going to get the assigned piece of data. But that's just like at a high level. Then how it's actually going to work in practice is, again, trying to reuse things that we already have. So not trying to basically utilize new networking components or constructions, but just trying to reuse things that we're already kind of comfortable with and already well tested and clients already have essentially for other reasons. In this case, subnets, which you can basically think of subnets as just, there exists the whole Ethereum network, and then there are these basically sub-networks where people are connected only to some of the rest of the network instead of all. And they only use them for specific things. So in this case, there will be like 32 of these sub-networks that each one dedicated to a specific part of the data. And so, yeah, essentially, going back to the picture before, we have a bunch of blobs. They've been extended in this way to do this for the sampling part. And then we split the data in some way, like it's going to be 32 chunks. Each chunk is going to be essentially a bunch of these columns, which are ultimately the samples that we care about. And yeah, basically, as a node, you'd have to go in a subnet that corresponds to one of these big chunks, so 4 columns essentially that are assigned to you, and just essentially gossip about that with other nodes, take part in propagating that, and then essentially have custody of that and be available to respond to sampling queries related to that data. So once you have distribution, so once you like somehow the data is being associated to a block, it's being disseminated in the network, everyone has their assigned part, if you want to do sampling, what you would do is you figure out, let's say that you want this first red column on the left, because you've like randomly flicked a coin and figured out, okay, this is my first sample. You figure out which of your peers is in that subnet, which is something that you can know from their node ID, and essentially ask them just to give you the column. And you do it for all the samples, essentially. So all you want to make sure of is that your peer set is basically diverse enough in terms of covering all the subnets. And yeah, another question that kind of, so we've covered essentially distribution and sampling, which are mainly two of the main aspects of the whole thing. Another aspect that's quite important is reconstruction. So the whole principle is that if the data is more than 50% available, we basically treat it as being actually fully available. So if someone really wanted to get the data, which might be useful for running a fraud-proof, like a challenge essentially for an optimistic rollup, or if you want to make sure that a validity rollup is live, so someone has the data and can push forward the state. So there might be cases where you actually really want to ensure that the data is not just 50% available, but it's like actually reconstructible to get the full data. And basically, the idea is that eventually we would like this to be a pretty robust distributed property, something that the network could do as a whole, collectively, let's say. So where essentially any node could contribute to this reconstruction part, for example, by reconstructing a single blob, as opposed to the whole kind of bigger matrix. So essentially the idea would be you shouldn't need to touch the whole data to be able to do the reconstruction. You can only do it, you can only even contribute to reconstruction just with some small parts of it. That doesn't cost you a lot of bandwidth or computational effort and so on. But yeah, for now the idea is that, again, in this mindset of simplifying and trying to do things gradually, so not trying to build like the perfect protocol all at once, but like kind of going one step at a time and introducing more and more components over time, which has been in some sense the philosophy since 4844 as well, because 4844 has already built a lot of the cryptographic primitives, for example, and other things as well. So yeah, basically the idea would be for now to not try to do distributed reconstruction, but instead to essentially rely on one of an assumption, which for example, is like something similar to what optimistic rollups do. Just assuming that there is some node somewhere that is willing to basically follow what's happening and should make a challenge in case there is fraud. So the idea here would be somewhat similar one of an assumption, but for liveness, we're essentially assume that at least someone is downloading the whole data and they'll be willing to reconstruct it if needed. So it could be like any one of you in the room could run a node that downloads the whole data, especially at first because it's not going to be that much data, and if needed, just reseed it in the network. Or it could be like an infrastructure provider, or like, essentially, there's a lot of parties that might have reasons to have the whole data, and we essentially rely on at least one of them to kind of honestly do this job of reconstructing. And yeah, again, this is only really important for liveness and not for safety, in the sense that offline, that anyone could go and put the pieces together in the reconstruction, but we kind of need someone to be online and doing this in a timely way for the network to be live. And yeah, so with 4844 we saw that we get maybe around like a 5x increase in essentially data throughput, or which corresponds to like rollup throughput at the end of the day, which is quite nice, but again, we want to do more. And with PeerDAS, essentially, without changing anything about the bandwidth that basically is set by 4844, so getting like a bandwidth that's similar to what we get with the 3 to 6 blobs of 4844, we could essentially have 32 to 64, so like a target of 32 and a max of 64 blobs per slot, which is around a 10x increase. We probably wouldn't actually immediately just go in and just bump up the blob count by 10x, but this could be like a gradual thing. Maybe at first just go to 816 and then slowly like get there. But then there's a point where this becomes also limited in itself, where like essentially to get more scaling from this, you would have to essentially again increase bandwidth requirements. Like it wouldn't just be possible to keep bumping up the block count without actually going over what 4844 requires. At which point, one thing that we can do is to do what essentially originally was proposed as as like kind of the final end game of data availability sampling, which is this 2D construction that you might have heard with the name Danksharding, but you can also think of it as 2D pure DAS essentially, where we basically do what we have before is the top there, so blobs stacked vertically and extended horizontally. But then there is another extension, like a vertical extension, so we introduce even more redundancy in the data, in this case vertical redundancy, so that even columns can be potentially reconstructed if like only 50% of them are available. Yeah, basically what this does is that sampling becomes a lot cheaper because you don't need to download columns anymore, but only you can only download cells. So essentially sampling becomes like negligibly cheap in the whole computation, and only distribution becomes the determining factor of how much bandwidth people actually need. So yeah, that would be kind of another step. But essentially the nice thing is that we're quite far from actually really needing to do this. So we can take 1 to tier DAS like pretty far. Okay. Yeah, and maybe with this, I think we can, without increasing bandwidth, get to even 256 max blobs, which was the original kind of target throughput for Danksharding, which would be around 40x from 4844. And yeah, that's it. You can find more on the post on the right, which is from Danny. It's like the original post that has introduced pure DAS with research, and this other post that I recently put on it research, which is somewhat similar to this presentation, but covering slightly different things. Thank you, and I think. Okay, yeah, okay, then just later, I guess, yeah, questions if you have any. Yeah, we can do them now.
When will this happen? When what's the latest?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not really on me to give timelines. I don't think anyone likes to do this. I would like this to happen as early as possible because I think it's very important. Like to me, scalability is like a really big priority in the Ethereum roadmap. I think in principle, because of the fact that a lot of the design here really relies on reusing things they already have, like clients are already comfortable with, there's not so much more complexity. I think maybe the stickier point is that still it touches a lot of networking things, which tend to be more complicated than others, like a bit, I guess, something that we're less used to. But also, I think with 4844, a lot of that has changed. A lot of like test infrastructure has been built around. And you've probably talked to Pari there in the back about this. He definitely knows a lot more about me. But yeah, I think.
So March.
Of next year, you mean? Yeah, I mean, I think possibly. Like it's not an unrealistic thing, but yeah, it's really going to depend. But also, it depends what exactly means. What's the next step? Because the next step could be. A lot of pure DAS is built, but we don't actually increase the block count. Just, for example, we could switch over to using sampling, but without actually increasing the number of blobs too much, so that it's kind of a controlled switch. Yeah, I don't know if you have any follow-up, otherwise.
I don't know whether you mentioned it and I missed it, but is that going to be an additional incentive system and penalty system, or is it built into the current proof of stake incentive system?
Incentive system for
to keeping, like, if you don't have the blob, right? You're being asked for the sample, and then you answer with a timeout because you actually don't have it, right? Like, what's like?
So I think it's very hard to incentivize this kind of like serving data because it's, you know, how do you know that someone has done it or not? It's quite hard. What you can do is on the networking level, you can introduce basically just use peer scoring techniques that we already have like a bunch of for all kinds of things. So like if your peers are consistently not able to give you samples that supposedly they should have, you can down score them or things like that. You can look for different peers, and so there's a lot of, I think, like networking level management things that you can do. I don't think there would be like an on-chain, let's say, like incentive reward system for this. Eventually there could be something like proof of custody, which is a bit of a whole different thing, but that's more just for basically making sure that there is an incentive to not be a lazy validator, and if you're being assigned a certain piece of data to download, you actually have an incentive to go and download it instead of just signing off on it. But here it's not even, I mean, I guess all that I've talked about here, it doesn't really have anything too specific to validators. It's really like all full nodes will need to be doing this, will need to be serving data, participating in distribution, and so on. So it's not something that depends specifically on validators. But basically, we do have the option potentially to do something a bit different for validators and make their role in the scheme potentially stronger and a bit, treated differently with different guarantees.
As far as I understand, you don't have access to this data from the Solidity smart contract. Is that correct?
Yeah, so already from 844 you only access the content.
Yeah, but is there any other way how, as a DApp developer, smart contract developer, I can use this data? How can that I get access to it?
I mean, there is the point evaluation precompile, which is like a precompile that allows you to basically, get like basically prove that the data at a specific point is what you're telling that it is, but you will not be able to directly just query the data. Like basically, if you want to use that data, you have to like provide it from outside as cold data and prove that it is what you said it is. But I think really, I mean, I don't know, I guess I've never thought about how can you use this data outside of rollups. In my mind, this is just a thing for rollups. And it's not something that should necessarily needs to have like an application for regular contracts. And those should still be using cold data, but I could be wrong.
I was just wondering if it's possible to abuse it, sort of, for
right.
storage or something.
Yeah, I don't really know. It's not something that I personally have thought too much about, but maybe if there anyone else in the room has thoughts about this, feel free to speak up.
Just to summarize again, so for 844, you said blocks are coming, we'll reduce the cost for rollups drastically, and then basically you spend a lot of time explaining what's coming next. Could you just say it so initially you start, how many blocks? You said like just 6, 16?
So 6 is I mean, originally when the IP was written, it was meant to be a target of 8 and a max of 16. Now it's a target of 3 and a max of 6, which correspond to about 0.37 megabytes of target and like twice as much as the limit.
But initially the AP44 will only start with 3, or just already with the max?
It will start with 3, yeah. Like, I see what the confusion is. So when I say target and max, the max isn't like a value that we eventually want to get to. It's just that in this kind of 1559 style pricing fee market mechanisms, you have basically a target for the utilization of a resource, which is like, I don't know, in the case of gas, it's 15 million gas, which is like essentially on average how much you use. And then there's a max, which is in any given block, you might use as much as 30 million gas. But on average, you cannot have 30 million gas. In this case, it's the same.
I mean, to be honest with you, I don't really understand that, but let me ask in a very simple way.
Sure.
There are a lot of calculations that say, hey, after the CAP, so much and so much like cost savings for gas costs. What do you think? Some of them are super optimistic, and some of them are not. So initially, what we will get, so just for you, because like, is it like more super up to 10x, or maybe just 3x, 4x, and then later?
So I think the issue is, so what we can say for sure is that compared to today, roughly there will be about 5 times more rollup transactions, just because the capacity, like the target capacity is about 5 times more what it actually used in practice today. I mean, today there isn't a target. The amount that is used just depends on how much it costs and how much people are willing to pay, essentially. So the capacity will increase by 5x. What the fees do is a different matter, because it could be that the capacity increases by 5x, but because of all this increase and more activity, people are actually willing to pay more. And so there's 5x more transactions, but they also cost the same as today. or like, I mean, principally could even cost more, but probably not. Like, what's likely gonna be the case is somewhere in between, I think. So that, yeah, we do get this increase in capacity, it does reduce fees, but probably not like by the amount that you might expect, because there is some kind of induced demand. And
So it's not that simple, yeah.
yeah, it's not really that simple. But we do know that the capacity will increase by that much, like that's for sure, basically.
Sorry, I've been raising my hand for a second. Okay, so regarding the PeerDAS stuff, what is the orchestrator that decides what nodes are serving what slots of data? I was not saying for
Okay, so basically it's all decided by the node ID. So the node ID will just through some deterministic function tell everyone else that is your peer which of these like 32 subnets you've been assigned to, and so that tells them exactly like if I need a column in the subnet that should have this guy, this is supposed to happen.
Okay, so then there's a level of determinism to like what
Yes.
nodes are supposed to be online constantly serving these like columns specifically. And then the second part of the question was when whoever came up with PeerDAS and like the need for PeerDAS, was there any kind of like metrics done on just having every single full node serve every single column, or was this just an idea that came out of like, oh, one day we'll probably need this? Like, was this like a metrics-based decision, or was this more like a research-based?
So do you mean like as in, could we just and we check if it's actually necessary to do the splitting? Yeah, I would say yes, because just I mean, for one thing, a lot of tests have been done for 844 specifically, because it does already have this element of like increasing how much bandwidth nodes use, and yeah, partially, initially, as I said before, like it started from 8 blobs being the target, it's been reduced to 3. This is because there's actually been done a lot of sub-tests that we've done on mainnet, for example, with big blocks or things like that, just to see like how does the network handle a lot of data going through, and it handles it okay, but like not like we could not have 10x as much data going through the network.
I have a bunch of follow-ups, so maybe I should ask them later, but they're more along the lines of like, do you guys use libTP transport for this specific component? Or is it some sort of custom node?
No, it's using it's really reusing the same like libTP P2P things that we use for the rest of the Ethereum, or the consensus layer, I should say, not.
It's interesting. It would be really nice to understand where the string actually is, because Ethereum blocks are quite small, right? So they're quite small, and the block times are like what, 12 seconds?
Yeah.
And so.
Although I should say like the block times are 12 seconds, but the propagation needs to be like it's 4 actually.
4. Okay. Well, regardless, okay. So the block times are 12 seconds. You need the 4 seconds to do the round trip, like to aim for that. But the throughput is actually quite small. Like you have quite small blocks and then also very small blocks. So it would be very interesting to understand where the actual string is coming from. Yeah, I mean, I think partially is that there is this amplification factor that comes from the way blocks are propagated. Like basically, like gossip subbeds is like. So gossiping blocks. Yeah, and so yeah, you essentially have, I think it's something like 8x amplification factor you get. So yeah. Like the vanilla gossip sub implementation of the yeah, it's like gossip sub 1.1. So yeah, that's part of it. I don't know if like, I mean, yeah, I think also like block sizes don't really compare too well to, like, blocks are much smaller than what blobs would be. Like even I think, I don't know, the amount of pool data on average that is in blocks is less than 100 kilobytes, which is not even one block. Yeah. So it's still quite a bit of difference. Yeah, no, it's definitely small. Yes. Yeah, it's still but yeah, I mean, it's also, I think a lot of it is just that we're still kind of quite interested in supporting a wide range of nodes, both for staking and for just like running full nodes. And a lot of this, it's not just for staking, but like for full nodes as well. But I'm sure, yeah, it's very possible that there might be like optimizations. I don't know. I'm not really a networking person myself, but
yeah, just a brief question here. So you mentioned the subnets. There's for the subnets, you can know which node stores what kind of data, so you can actually reconstruct the data. But where are these node identifiers actually stored? Like how do I get access
What
to
are these?
node identifiers? So you mentioned through the node ID, I actually know which other nodes have the specific kind of data I'm looking for. So how do I get access? Like how do I then, if you run through that process of me reconstructing the data I need to whatever request, how would it look like?
So I guess I'm not entirely sure I understand the reconstruction part of your question.
Yeah, exactly. So how, I mean, if I were to have a request and to a certain piece of data where it requires the data that different kind of nodes are storing, because you're saying there's data availability sampling, how do I then get through the node ID the data I need for whatever request I have?
So basically, like you know the node ID of your peers, and from so I mean, if you're getting a request from someone, it's because by your node ID, you're actually already supposed to have the data, as opposed to needing to go and ask someone else. Like if your node ID dictates that you're in subnet 1, and someone asks you for a column that belongs to subnet 1, you should already have the data. And the way you should run it is that being in a subnet essentially means connecting to other peers that are also interested in the same topic, so are also in the subnet, and you would have participated in propagation of these columns that belong to the subnet. So by the time someone asks you for it, you should already have it. As far as like how do you find nodes that are in a certain subnet, we already have like discovery processes that nodes use to find other nodes, and that would use the same kind of similar infrastructure. But like at a certain point, you shouldn't be doing this all the time. It's not that you, let's say, toss a coin and say, okay, this time I want column 10, let me find someone that has column 10. You should already have a set of peers that you're like stably connected to, which you already know cover the subnet space well, so that you can just point at someone that you know has column 10 and just ask them for it. So you shouldn't like constantly be running discovery to find new nodes as like live kind of.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Is the sampling process part of the consensus, or like where does that come in?
So yeah, I guess something I should have said is basically all of peer does is actually just a networking upgrade. The only part that actually touches anything else really is the block count increase. Like if you want to increase the block count, then you need to like do some other stuff. But other than that, it's really just a networking change. And in principle, yeah, you don't really like. I mean, the beacon chain is nothing about this. There's nothing that has to do with like state transition or it's all kind of outside. I mean, obviously, like you need nodes to. If you want nodes to speak to each other, they all need to like be on peer DAS, but like. Yeah, that does that.
Yeah, I can.
So when starting to prune here, would you say it makes sense to prune the rest as well? So just prune the entire blockchain? After all, like with Gesper, for example, you can verify from Genesis anyway.
Right. I mean, personally, I'm pretty pro pruning because I think that given that we have subjectivity as like already kind of part of the design, it doesn't really make sense to me to sync from Genesis. But I do understand that like there's some level of like anxiety about really changing in this fundamental way. Like we're just like having this strong guarantee of like the whole blockchain is like replicating it in all of these nodes, and it feels nice, and you can go and look at the whole history. I wouldn't particularly be worried that the history would disappear, but yeah, I think there's like a lot of differing opinions, and I think this is a lot more contentious than pruning blobs. I think also just because basically pruning blobs changes nothing for you if all you care about is Ethereum L1. Like even if blobs disappear, if you don't care about rollups, you basically just don't really need to care. And even for rollups, it's like fine in the sense that at that point it would have like any kind of fraud-proof game would have already happened by the time 18 days have passed. So I think it's a bit of a different decision.
How does the proving of exclusion work for these blocks? Like I'm a rollup, I want to know that my block is actually included in the block. What's proving mechanism?
So for Zk rollups, I think there's like some kind of a proof of equivalence thing that you need to do, like within the, like you have a validity proof, and inside the proof, you're going to need to prove something about the commitment. For optimistic rollups, I don't think you really yeah, I don't think there's like too much that
Would you need to download the entire, like, every single blog? Or would you just be able to download the wrong blog and then have like separate groups?
I see. So I mean ultimately as a rollup node, you should only need to download the data that's relevant to you, the blobs that are relevant to you. But I think you would need to do that somehow like through the L2 network as opposed to like directly being able to from L1 like point to this. I mean, you can do like request response, like really request like specific blobs that you want, but like for example, if you're trying to just live like follow what's happening, you wouldn't know that a blob that's relevant to like arbiter or whatever has been included at a specific index. So there isn't like a clear way for you to just like follow your blobs.
Okay, so
that or like you have to rely on like somehow the data has to get to the L2 network and then you just get it from there. There's like basically some like kind of bridge that only, but bridge not in the sense of like smart contract bridge, but just like
some wrapper that just looks at that blog that is also
yeah, some node that is like downloading everything and just dumps only those blobs in the L2 network or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think these are also good questions because I think these parts of the design can be changed if like, I don't know, they different decisions make more sense. So I think we're like open to listening to like, try to work with L2s to figure out what makes sense.
I mean, just to connect what you just said, like a non-technical question, has this been validated with the peeps at Arbitrum and Optimism so they can actually use it?
So I mean, so from their perspective, I think a lot of it should really, a lot of it should not really change after 4844. Like they'll need to upgrade to 4844 like to support logs, but then PeerDAS won't really change that much for them. Like the only thing that what it should look like from their perspective is all of a sudden there's more blobs, basically. I mean, that's not quite entirely true because yeah, there is this aspect of, okay, how do you actually get the blobs from the network? And yeah, I think that's, I don't know, I would say it's like TBD. I don't know exactly what's like the intended method for them to do that.
Yeah, but they reviewed the IP or they feedback on that?
I mean, I'm not really sure personally. Well, Pari has.
They have, they're all live on test and they
Great, thank you.
Oh, do you mean like 4844 or PeerDAS? Okay, yeah, no, 4844, yes, absolutely, yes. I mean, they're like in the process of like upgrading their testnets and stuff. Yeah, I mean, PeerDAS, I don't know, it's been shared as like a research idea. I don't know if like they looked deeply into it, to be honest, but yeah, hopefully they will.
So following up on that, how much do you think nowadays, compared to past years, Ethereum got it up and also as my roles?
I mean, I guess depends what you mean by influence. I think I don't find it strange to focus on this. It's not like rollups are like begging us to focus on this because this is literally what the roadmap has been. I want to say for the last however many years, I guess 3, 4 or something. Depends how you think about it. Maybe you could say that it's always been the roadmap. Like this is like some form of sharding at the end of the day. So yeah, I mean, I think it's also healthy in some sense that they do influence the roadmap, but I wouldn't say that this is a case of like, oh, we're doing this because L2s are, I don't know, like, it's just, we do want Ethereum to scale, and this is how we've chosen to scale it, so let's scale it. I don't know, that's my view, but. Okay.
Yeah, now I can send transactions from one server account to another server account and put whatever random block I want and call it. Right? So it is accessible to write to the storage callback. What about blocks? Is it like restricted access to write to this storage for blocks?
No, it's like anyone. It's permissionless, like everything to make a transaction of the format, which includes a KZG commitment to a block. So like basically there's this transaction format which contains.
So, specific type of transaction.
Yeah, but it's not like it's not restricted to anyone. So like anyone can send this kind of transaction, just pay for the blob, and yeah, it's just. But I mean.
It will be just cheaper than Coldplay.
Yeah, sure. Again, I don't know what exactly you would do with it outside of the rollup, but I'm sure you can find things. Yeah.
Just for fun.
Yeah, no, yeah, sure. Yeah, no, you can. I mean, you can. Yeah, you can. It's arbitrary data. It doesn't have any like interpretation, so it's a priori like it's only a protocol talk that would interpret it in some way, and it could be a rollup, but it could be something else. So.
I think it could be even just an image.
Yeah.
Chain servers which
You could definitely do that. I mean, you can even do that on testnets right now if you want to try it out. On testnets. On Gurley is already forked, and Pulaski is forked in 3 hours or so. And
Alright,
okay.